Good morning.
Good morning.
I am delighted to be with you virtually this morning as you continue your sermon series based on your windows. And I have worked alongside Reverend Mark at St. Paul's before I'm at Yonge Street Mission. I am currently at YSM on staff there full-time, and I'm so delighted to also hear that you've been participating in the Give 6 campaign, and I understand we'll have a little bit of chance to talk about that afterwards. So do stay on after the service if you want to hear more about that or if you have some questions about that. For those who don't know, YSM is a faith-based poverty alleviation focused mission based here in Toronto, far beyond just the Yonge Street corridor. So I'll be glad to tell you more about that. But for now, I want to bring our attention to the Bible reading that we heard just now from the book of Luke. And this is one of the sort of singular story that we have of Jesus from his youth. You know, that age of 12, which is the edge of puberty and adolescence, the time just before the awkward growth spurts and hormones. And yes, in case you're wondering, I am the parent of teenagers, and I have high schoolers, and they are currently 17 and 15. So that age of 12 is not too far from my memory. Now, on the surface, this pilgrimage that Jesus takes with his family bears little resemblance to my family or even likely yours, because we live in a city, often in small spaces and small groups. In fact, across Toronto, over half the people live on their own. That's what the stats tell us. People actually literally live individually, which would just not have been the case back in Jesus' time. And when I do get to see my extended family, and that was prior to COVID, it would usually be once a year for a family reunion. And I certainly don't travel by foot in a large group to visit a religiously significant space. So on one level, it seems like there's not a lot of overlap. But if you kind of look past the physical setting to the social relationship dynamics in this story, those dynamics of how Jesus relates to his parents and Jesus then relates to other people, those I can certainly relate to, and I think you can too. I'm going to start by looking at Jesus's parents in this passage and in this window, but we're going to look at it from 3 perspectives. So as you can see on your screen, the window is still there. There are actually 3 different groups of people that are profiled on this window. The parents, the teachers, and then obviously Jesus himself. The parents are the 2 characters farthest away that you can see there at the back looking at Jesus from behind. Then you see the 3 teachers. One's holding a scroll and bringing it forward. One is sort of sitting looking up at Jesus, and the other is reading the scroll and sort of kneeling before him. And then finally, in the middle there is Jesus, the one in the red robe, barefoot, in what I think of as typical COVID hair, shoulder length and very messy. But that is Jesus. So let's start with his parents, shall we? Let's consider the perspective, the situation from their perspective. Hold on, I've got to click something here on my screen that got in the way. But we're going to look at it starting from Jesus's parents' perspective. Holy and devout, Mary and Joseph are following the customs for traveling to this place of Jerusalem for the high holiday of Passover. They're going to the temple to remember the freedom that God has wrought for God's people. How God brought the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, passing over the homes that were marked by the blood of the Lamb. That's what this Passover celebration would have been remembering. And given how they traveled in those extended family units back then, it took them a whole day of traveling before they realized that their 12-year-old son, Jesus, was not in this group of relatives traveling with them. And so Mary and Joseph go back to the city of Jerusalem and start anxiously looking for him. Now, this word anxiously, it's a really strong word. It means suffering deep personal anguish. It's a consuming sorrow. It talks about experiencing intense emotional pain. Mary and Joseph were very rightly upset. They were they experienced what you would expect parents to experience when they are lost their child. They are experiencing a level of relationship pain that most of us do experience at some point in our lives. Now, whether it be the COVID isolation or illness that brings on this kind of sorrow for us, it can even happen in other times, right? In this season of pandemic, it might have been those two things, but outside of the pandemic, outside of temporarily misplacing children, things like divorce, serious diagnoses, depression, all of these things can bring us to that place of anguish, that place of anxiety that Mary and Joseph are described to be in this story. When Mary and Joseph finally find Jesus, they actually see him through this haze of deep anxiety. And their question is why? Why, Jesus? That's a question that is echoed across generations in the face of suffering. Why? Why would Jesus treat them so? Why would Jesus allow this bad thing to happen to me, to your loved ones, to your neighbor, to our country, to our city? And I imagine the tone of Mary and Joseph as they approach Jesus, finding him to be quite accusatory and hurt, that they're emotionally in deep pain. And so, because I try not to project on the text, but actually try the text to hear what the text says, I checked that Greek word there to see if my sort of parental imagination and personal experiences actually lined up with what that Greek word was. When it says they were astonished when they saw him, it literally means to like strike out because of having lost your senses. So not only does the text talk about how upset they are, it actually is saying they were like verbally almost berating Jesus. They're literally striking out kind of in that way that we do in the sort of broken human way when we are in a great deal of pain. But then there's Jesus's reply. In line with how he is an adult and in his ministry later, Jesus actually responds to their question with a question of his own. Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I would be here? Didn't you know that I would be in my Father's house? Notice how this response that Jesus gives takes this question of why, where the questioner is at the center of it, and turns it upside down. The parents wanted to know how it was that Jesus could treat them. They are the center of that question in such a way. And Jesus turns this question outward, and he turns the question upward to his purpose and to his connection with the Creator. Friends, when we experience suffering, you turn to Jesus. Maybe you turn to Jesus. Maybe you turn somewhere else for relief. And when you turn to Jesus, what do you say to God? Do you say why? Do you throw out all your emotions to him? I hope so. I hope that you do, because Jesus is not scared or upset with your grief or your questions or even your doubts. He knows all of that anyway. But as we bring all of that, as Mary and Joseph did, to Jesus, it helps us to identify and untangle all our own stuff, especially if, like Jesus's parents, we listen to the reply, even if we don't understand it. That's the other amazing thing about this story. It says very clearly they didn't really understand. They hear the answer, they don't understand, and yet they accept it and they hold it in their hearts. Has that ever happened to you? Where you pray in anguish and you get an answer that you don't understand? It has certainly happened to me over the years a number of times. I can remember a few years ago, I was praying, and I was actually quite angry at God. I was angry at God, and this is going to sound a little bit strange, but someone had just told me that they were pregnant for the second time, this couple that I knew. And I was really mad at God. That sounds strange, I know, but I was mad and talked to God about it because I knew and had watched these young parents with their first child. And I thought of so many other couples that I knew who wanted children, hadn't had a child yet at all, and who would have been good and faithful and kind parents. And I, I said, God, this is not fair. How come you are blessing them? How come they get a second one? And all these other people that I know who have been praying have not had a child of their own. Now, I was ranting, venting, totally admit it. I was in that place, I think, of deep anguish and kind of striking out at God in this way. And I'm very grateful that we can do that in our prayers to God, and He holds that. And usually when I pray like that, after I vent, usually what happens is the emotional tension releases, and then in the quiet, I come to a scripture. Some Bible passages is reminded of me, and I'm able to sit with that, and my perspective changes. But in this particular case, I remember it very clearly because God spoke to me, and He said, the first child needs a sibling. And I was like, ooh, ouch. I was admonished, and my perspective was completely reset because my question was wrong. The center of my focus, even in my prayers, was in the wrong place. 10 years later, that family now has 3 children, and I still pray for them when I do see them. I try to keep what God spoke to me in that moment at the focus of how I relate with them, which is to engage the children that they have, to help each other in what it means for those children to be siblings to one another. Friends, when you pray, when you look for Jesus, do you also wait and listen to His words and hold them in your heart, even if you don't understand them in the moment? The first question that this text and this window poses to us today. Now, the second group of people that are in this window profiled were the temple teachers. In this story, the temple teachers are amazed by Jesus. They are amazed at His understanding and His answers. And unlike so many other examples in our scriptures, especially later in Jesus's life, where the religious leaders are the ones protecting the institution or their political positions, where they're the ones who are, actually against Jesus. In this case, the teachers listen and are amazed. They are the ones surrounding Jesus. And so in this case, it is in fact, they are the models for us to follow because Jesus is among them and their attention is fully focused on them, on Him. And that's a beautiful thing for me. It's a beautiful thing to remember and see that as we look at our scriptures, and especially later on in Jesus' life where people have lost their way, there is still this callback at the beginning of His ministry, even before He was baptized, where the people of that time, the teacher of that time, could actually hear and could actually see God in Jesus at that time. And just as Jesus was among the teachers back then, Jesus is among us today too. Just as we are reading the word and gathered virtually, as we are singing our hymns, absolutely. But He's also with us day in and day out, when we rise, when we spend our time alone, as we are still doing much of the time in COVID, and even when we come to the end of our lives. Jesus is at hand and inviting us to be with Him as He was with those teachers. Now, the third most important character, obviously, in the window and in the story is Jesus Himself. And what I find beautiful about how this window was set up is that Jesus is the literal center of the window, and His eyes are looking back at us, the viewers. That window is giving us that visual invitation, implicit in the text, of Jesus calling us to be with Him. His eyes are open, looking at us. His hands are kind of open in a half blessing and half teaching posture. So next time when you're in that place, experiencing the suffering that we do in this world, when you are facing doubts, instead of maybe turning to Netflix for relief, remember this invitation from Jesus. Remember how his hands and eyes are open, that he sees and hears even the most anguished of our cries. To close, there's two more things I want to point out from the window. You're going to see it come up on your screen now again. So I want to point out two more things that are beautiful and have been placed here. One is that just behind Jesus, there is a central wooden altar. And just behind him to the right, as we're looking at, there's a curtain. Just pull to the side, it's green. Both of these symbols in the window remind us and point us to, foreshadow if you want, what is yet to come. At 12, obviously, Jesus was still growing in wisdom and in stature. But already, even at 12, let's remember he was still fully divine and still fully human. And while he was maturing as a person, the divine plan that God ordained from the beginning of time was already in place, a plan that leads to both his sacrifice and to the curtain being torn in two. And so that Passover sacrifice that the family that Jesus was with had brought him to celebrate in Jerusalem, that they were commemorating on that pilgrimage when he got lost from his parents, that is fulfilled in Jesus, the sacrificial lamb. This is the symbol of the altar behind him, who sets us free, not just from the slavery of being bound to oppressors in this world, but from the slavery of sin itself. And in that window, that central altar reminds us that that is to come in who Jesus is. This window also reminds us that the temple curtain there on the side reminds us of what happens when Jesus goes to the cross. Because in the cross, at that time when Jesus sacrifices his life for us, that temple curtain, which at the time kept the holiest place where God was from everyone else in the temple, let alone the rest of the world, that temple isn't just pulled back, which is what it's done in this window to say, hey, this is coming. It's actually torn in two, symbolizing the beginning of the ultimate renewal of the earth. And as I mentioned before, Jesus's presence, God's presence with us, not being limited in time or space just to a holy place, but to everywhere at all time because of the power of the Spirit that comes upon us. I'm sure that's going to be one of the further windows that comes to through this series. So I know that this story, for those of you and for me who've been in the church a while, is a very familiar one. And yet in it, as we think about that story and reflect on how it's been depicted in the art today, there's still so much richness to reflect upon. So as we go into this week and as we spend a little bit time now of reflecting on what it might be that God has for us from this story, from this art in our own lives and how we live them, I invite you to remember that Jesus is seeking you, inviting you to come near, no matter what the circumstance, no matter what you're feeling emotionally or socially or spiritually, that his hands are open and his eyes are both on you and in tune with what is in line with heaven. And so let's take a moment now and do as the teachers are in this story, to sit at the foot of Jesus with this posture of listening and reflect on what it might mean for us to spend more time in his presence. So let's listen now to the song, Give Me Jesus.